When people talk about the possibility of a wider war between the United States and Iran, they often focus only on military strength. They compare fighter jets, missiles, and defense budgets as if those numbers alone determine the outcome. But I think that's a very narrow way of looking at this conflict. The real question isn't who has the bigger military, the real question is who has more to lose if this war expands. And when you look at the geography of the region, the answer becomes much more complicated than many people assume. We all remember what happened during the 40-day war, when American and Israeli forces struck Iran's South Pars gas field. That attack was supposed to increase pressure on Iran, yet what followed showed something very different. Iran's response was immediate, coordinated, and significant enough to demonstrate that it was prepared to retaliate, rather than simply absorb the attack. That moment sent an important message to everyone watching the conflict. It showed that every action would be answered, and that escalation would not remain one-sided. This is why I believe many people underestimate the risks of pushing this conflict even further. If another major strike takes place, Iran is unlikely to respond in a limited or symbolic way. It has repeatedly signaled that any future retaliation would be larger and more damaging than before. Whether others agree with that assessment or not, it is clearly the calculation Iran wants its adversaries to consider before making the next move. What makes this situation especially dangerous is geography. Many of America's closest regional partners are located only a short distance from Iran. Military bases, energy infrastructure, ports, and other strategic assets are all within reach. Iran doesn't necessarily need to rely on its longest-range missile systems to threaten those targets. From its perspective, many of them are already close enough to be reached with capabilities it already possesses. That reality changes the balance of risk because any escalation could affect not only Iran and the United States but the entire region. That is exactly why I believe the responsibility doesn't rest only with Washington. It also rests with the governments across the region that continue allowing American military operations to be launched from their territory and airspace. No country can claim to be neutral while its bases, airspace, and logistical networks are being used in an active military campaign. Whether they participate directly or indirectly, they inevitably become part of the conflict in the eyes of the opposing side. If the United States were to expand this war by targeting Iran's critical infrastructure, such as power plants or other civilian facilities, I don't believe the response would be limited to a similar target inside Iran. Iran has repeatedly signaled that it would respond on a much broader scale. Instead of matching one target for another, it would aim at the wider network of strategic assets spread across the region. That distinction is extremely important because it raises the cost of escalation far beyond what many policymakers appear to consider. For the neighboring states, this creates a very difficult choice. They can continue supporting a strategy that risks turning their own countries into part of the battlefield, or they can work to prevent further escalation before the situation reaches that point. Once a conflict begins spreading across multiple countries, controlling it becomes far more difficult. History has shown that wars often expand far beyond what leaders originally intended. That is why I believe the smartest path is not more aggression but de-escalation. Every new strike increases the chances of a regional conflict that nobody can fully control. Preventing that outcome is not only America's responsibility, it is also the responsibility of every government whose territory is being used to sustain this military campaign. The consequences of that decision go far beyond military strategy. Much of the Gulf depends on continuous access to electricity, desalination plants, and energy infrastructure. In this region, water doesn't simply come from rivers or rainfall. Millions of people rely on facilities that require a constant supply of power. If those systems stop functioning, daily life can begin breaking down within hours. Hospitals, communications, transportation, businesses, and basic public services all depend on that same infrastructure. That is why I believe the risks are often underestimated. This isn't simply about whether one missile hits one target. It's about what happens afterward. If critical infrastructure across the region is disabled, the economic and humanitarian consequences would spread rapidly. In the extreme heat and humidity that characterize much of the Gulf, prolonged disruptions to electricity and water supplies would create an emergency unlike anything these countries have experienced in recent decades. For that reason, regional governments cannot assume they will escape the consequences if the conflict continues to expand. Geography makes that impossible. Their security, their economies, and the daily lives of their citizens are directly tied to the decisions being made today. That is why preventing further escalation should be their highest priority, because once a wider regional war begins, no one can guarantee where it will end, or who will pay the greatest price. Some governments may believe that if the United States decides to carry out these operations, the responsibility belongs to Washington alone. I don't think that argument holds. When foreign aircraft use your airspace, when military bases on your territory support those operations, and when logistical networks under your control help sustain the campaign, neutrality becomes very difficult to claim. In any conflict, actions matter far more than official statements. From Iran's perspective, there is little distinction between the country launching the attack and the countries enabling it. If military operations are being supported from neighboring territory, those governments become part of the strategic equation. Whether the international community agrees with that interpretation or not, It is the reality shaping Iran's calculations. That is why I believe these governments have a direct interest in preventing further escalation, rather than assuming they can remain on the sidelines. The choice therefore is becoming increasingly simple. Either the region moves toward de-escalation through diplomacy, or it accepts the growing risk that more countries will be pulled into the conflict. Once that line is crossed, the consequences will not be limited to military targets. Energy markets, trade routes, investment, and regional stability would all come under enormous pressure. This is why I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Preventing a wider war is no longer just about protecting Iran or protecting American interests. It is about protecting the entire region from a conflict whose economic and humanitarian costs could far exceed any short-term military objective. In the end, this isn't really about proving who has the stronger military. It's about understanding the cost of miscalculation. History is filled with conflicts that leaders believed would remain limited, only to watch them spread far beyond their original objectives. Once that process begins, controlling the pace of escalation becomes increasingly difficult. Every response invites another, and every new strike creates pressure for an even stronger retaliation. That is why I believe every government in the region should be asking a single question: is any political objective worth risking the stability of the entire Gulf? If the answer is no, then the priority should be preventing further escalation before events move beyond anyone's control. Diplomacy may be slow and frustrating, but it is far less costly than a regional war whose consequences could last for years. Ultimately, the choice belongs not only to Washington or Tehran, but also to every regional government that has allowed itself to become part of this confrontation. They cannot claim they had no role if their territory, airspace, and military facilities are being used to support military operations. Every decision they make now carries consequences, and those consequences will be shared by the entire region. That is why I believe the smartest course is to end the aggression before another line is crossed. Because once critical infrastructure is destroyed, once electricity and water systems fail, and once the conflict spreads beyond its current boundaries, there may be no easy way back. At that point, nobody will be talking about who won the first exchange. The only question left will be how much the entire region lost by allowing the crisis to escalate in the first place. Before this conflict moves any further, I think it's important to step back and recognize what is really at stake. This is no longer just a dispute between two countries. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy corridors, carrying a significant share of global oil and gas exports. Any disruption there doesn't remain a regional issue for long. It affects energy prices, financial markets, global trade, and the economies of countries thousands of miles away. That's why every military decision made in this region has consequences far beyond the battlefield. I also think many policymakers underestimate how quickly escalation can become irreversible. It's always easier to start a military exchange than to stop one. Once critical infrastructure is hit, once civilian services begin failing, and once regional governments are drawn directly into the conflict, political leaders lose much of their ability to control events. At that point, decisions are no longer being driven by careful strategy alone. They're driven by retaliation, public pressure, and the fear of appearing weak. That is why I continue to believe the only rational path forward is de-escalation. Military power can destroy targets, but it cannot rebuild regional stability once it has been lost. Every side involved should understand that another round of escalation may not produce a decisive victory. Instead, it could create a crisis that damages everyone involved, regardless of who fired the first missile. In the end, the choice is still available. Governments can continue down the path of confrontation, accepting the enormous risks that come with it, or they can recognize that preventing a wider regional war serves everyone's long-term interests. History will not judge leaders only by how strongly they responded in moments of crisis. It will also judge whether they had the wisdom to prevent a conflict from becoming far more destructive than it ever needed to be.